to introduce our keynote speaker, Gigi Sohn. Gigi's bio is in the packet, but I just want to give you some highlights. She is a distinguished fellow at the Georgetown Law School Institute for Technology and Law Policy. And from 2013 to 2016, she served as counselor to FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler. And she is credited with being one of the chief architects of that FCC's net neutrality rules. And actually, Bill Valley and I and Senator Beth Bai and Comptroller Kevin Lembo were a guest of Gigi at the FCC hearing in February 2016 where those rules were rolled out. So we got to meet Chairman Wheeler, got to meet many luminaries in the room, including Steve Wozniak, founder of Apple. That was pretty cool. Microsoft, excuse me. And Apple, I was right the first time. Right, okay. And Gigi's regarded as one of the leading advocates for open, affordable, and democratic, small d, internet communication networks. So she's a hero to a lot of people. And you know, personally and significantly for me, she has been such a good friend and ally to me, to the Office of Consumer Counsel, and to the state of Connecticut. She spoke at our last conference at the Yale School of Management a couple years ago, and she traveled here today to Hartford at great personal inconvenience, I will say. She had to speak in New York this morning. She got into the train station at 2:30, and I think you have to fly to DC right after this. So, so thank you for that. But that is Gigi. She always shows up. She is always fierce, and she always challenges us and makes us think. She is a truth teller. If you have a dumb idea, she will tell you. But if you have a great idea, she will tell you that, and she will back you all the way and do whatever she can to make it happen. And as I said, she really went to great lengths to be here today, and that means so much to all of us. So with great gratitude, let me introduce my friend Gigi Sohn.
Thank you, Elin. I mean, who would pass up an opportunity to come to Hartford? Come on. I do want to thank Elin and Deb for, can I shut this? Well, I'm not going to ask permission. I'm a truth teller. I want to thank Elin and Deb for inviting me to come here. I care deeply about the issues you've discussed today. That last panel was fantastic. I wish I could give a speech all about 5G and 5G hype and 5G promise, but that'll be another speech and for another time. So I'm really, I don't know about you guys, but the election wore me out, and I did keep tabs on the Connecticut gubernatorial race, which seemed to go to the next day. And of course, the election is still not over. I feel like the election has lasted for 2 years. And in 2 years, we're going to have to do it all over again. So I'm pretty beat, but pretty upbeat, particularly for the future of some of these issues that we're going to talk about today. And really, no matter who you voted for on Election Day or what party you belong to, I think we can all agree on one thing. Access to high-speed broadband is one of the most important issues in the U.S. today. In congressional race after congressional race, in Maine, Vermont, Virginia, Ohio, Tennessee, Colorado, Michigan, and New Mexico, just to name a few, voters said that broadband access was a top 3 issue. Sometimes coming in after health care and jobs, and sometimes, like in Vermont, coming in as the #1 concern for voters. And for those of you who don't know, in Colorado, where they have a law where you have to have a ballot initiative in order for a community to build their own network. I think 18, is that right? Chris Mitchell, he knows, 18 communities just voted this election day to take back their ability to build their own networks, and I think that's really, really fantastic. So look, nationwide, there's strong consensus that one has to be connected to broadband in order to participate fully in our society, in our culture, in our economy. But while the Trump administration and Congress addressed health care and jobs in the first 2 years, I believe it hasn't done very much to ensure that every American is connected to high-speed broadband internet. This is despite the core requirement in the Communications Act in Section 1, the very first section, that communication by wire and radio with adequate facilities at reasonable charges must be made available to all people of the United States without discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. Now, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai said on his very first day in that role, that closing the digital divide would be, in his words, one of his core priorities. But I would argue that rather than closing the digital divide, his FCC has made it wider. The FCC repealed the 2015 net neutrality rules and at the same time abdicated its oversight of the broadband market. The FCC no longer regulates or oversees the broadband market in any way. Pai has a proposal that would gut the Lifeline program, leaving low-income Americans without the subsidy they need to afford broadband. The E-rate program that provides broadband to schools and libraries is being undermined in more subtle ways. For instance, the FCC and the Universal Service Administrative Company are sowing doubt about future funding to those schools and libraries that want to build their own, more cost-effective fiber networks. The FCC, as Joanne said so articulately, just placed its foot on the neck of states and localities that want to determine how the infrastructure for 5G should be deployed. So what's the result? 39% of rural residents still lack broadband, prices remain high, and nearly 3/4 of the country has access to no more than 2 broadband providers. Now, I could go on, but believe it or not, the purpose of my talk is not to dwell on the negative. I gave a talk in Ohio, Chris invited me to, and I was pretty negative for about all 20 minutes. But I'm not here to dwell on the negative. Instead, what I want to do is draw a contrast between what's happening at the federal level, where I spend most of my energy, and what's happening at the state and local levels, where many of you dwell. I have no doubt that the most important work to ensure that all Americans have access to affordable high-speed broadband is happening in local communities like Chicopee and Taunton, Massachusetts, Longmont, Colorado, Imperial County, California, Fair Lawn, Ohio, and Kent County, Maryland. The most vibrant efforts to ensure that where there is broadband, residents adopt the service and are well-versed in using it are in cities like Boston, Austin, Louisville, Kansas City, and San Jose. And 34 states across the nation work to fill the gap in broadband oversight since the beginning of the year. So let's talk about community broadband first. You know, when I was at the FCC, it was the issue I most loved working on. I love to travel across the country and see once struggling industrial, tobacco, and farming towns reinvent themselves and their economies with high-speed internet. Now, everybody knows of the great successes in places like Chattanooga, Tennessee, where the Electric Power Board, or EPB, just announced that it surpassed 100,000 subscribers, and Lafayette, Louisiana, which announced a few months ago that it was providing 10 gigabit symmetrical service. But new, lesser-known systems are popping up all over the country, like Fairlawn Gig outside of Akron, Ohio. I had the privilege of seeing Fairlawn Gig's facilities last September. Thanks to the leadership of Mayor William Roth and Deputy Director of Public Service Ernie Statton, every one of Fairlawn's 7,500 residents has access to gigabit symmetrical broadband for $80 a month, or 100 megabits per second for just $40 a month. And over half of the households in Fairlawn subscribe. By comparison, I pay $80 a month for 50 megabits per second symmetrical. So that's 20 times less than what the citizens of Fairlawn get for the same price. Now, how does Fairlawn Gig do it? First and foremost, return on investment was not a driving factor in its decision to build and price the service. Fairlawn Gig proudly calls itself a municipal broadband utility. And if you listen to the lobbyists in Washington, D.C., calling broadband a utility is the worst thing you could possibly call broadband. And it calls it a municipal broadband utility, even though, unlike Chattanooga EPB and Lafayette, Fairlawn Gig was not born of the town's electric or water service. Like most Americans, Fairlawn Gig considers broadband to be essential infrastructure. And again, only in Washington, D.C., where incumbent broadband providers have a lobbyist for every member of Congress, is an anathema to think of broadband that way, to think of it as essential infrastructure as a utility. Second, I think this is really critical, Fairlawn Gig chose not to be a subscription TV provider. And this was a really wise decision. Programming costs are behind recent cable and satellite price hikes of between 3% and 4%, which doesn't include new add-on fees like broadcast TV fees and sports network fees. Instead, Fairlawn Gig has a streaming guide that explains the various options for online subscription services and explains how to access and use them. They even have in-person tutorials if you want to learn how to stream as a hands-on experience. Third, Fairlawn Gig invested wisely. It took $10.1 million out of its general fund without payback requirements and didn't levy either taxes or assessments on its residents. By the way, LeBron James lives in Fairlawn, and the Fairlawn Gig guy who drove me around showed me his house. So I'm forever indebted to the guy from Fairlawn Gig. Right next door in Massachusetts, Taunton Light Plant is rapidly expanding its residential broadband service to the 57,000 residents of that city. TLP began providing fiber connectivity to businesses in 1997, and then to one apartment building, a local school, and hospitals. But it recently expanded to 11 neighborhoods, with 24 more having applied for connectivity and 65 others expressing interest. Like Fairlawn Gig, it doesn't provide subscription programming, opting instead to educate its subscribers about streaming options. This allows it to charge just $34.95 a month for 50 megabits per second, less than half what I pay, and $69.95 for 1 gig. Not every community has the capacity to provide residential service right away. So instead, they choose to start by connecting anchor institutions like schools, government buildings, universities, and hospitals. Faced with limited access to broadband infrastructure, the county formed the Imperial Valley Telecommunications Authority, right? That sounds a lot like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which entered into an agreement with the local power and water district to use shared fiber optic cable between communities, along with poles, towers, and other resources. Today, the ITVA provides connectivity to 120 sites for 30 community anchor institutions in 12 major communities, using a combination of fiber and both unlicensed and educational broadcast service spectrum. Now, I'd be remiss if I failed to mention that communities in 19 states are still barred from building or expanding their broadband networks. Laws that were passed with the urging of the largest incumbent cable and broadband companies. And as some of you know, when I was at the FCC, we tried to preempt the laws of the states of North Carolina and Tennessee that prohibited EPB and the Wilson, North Carolina system from expanding and from anybody else from building. And the Sixth Circuit overturned us. But we tried, and it was a noble try. We knew it was going to be difficult. But unfortunately, this is something that Congress is going to have to fix. And I'm actually somewhat hopeful that with a Democratic House and a bunch of rural Republican senators who are not very pleased with the choices that their citizens have, and with the fact that this was a major election issue, that perhaps, just perhaps, we could get legislation that preempts the state laws that prevents local communities from choosing what kind of broadband they want to serve their constituents with. Of course, it's not enough just to make broadband available to your communities. 20% of Americans still lack broadband access, with half of those choosing not to adopt such technology, even though it's available to them. There are a variety of reasons why people don't adopt broadband, including cost, lack of digital literacy, and plain old trust. Under the Obama administration, the federal government was very active in working with communities to promote digital inclusion. The 2009 stimulus bill set aside $250 million to fund community-based digital inclusion projects. And those were the days. The projects were selected and funded by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which is part of the Department of Commerce. In addition, as required by the 2016 Lifeline Reform Order, the FCC published a digital inclusion plan, which, among other things, made a series of recommendations for increasing education and outreach, fostering new partnerships, especially with philanthropies, and creating policies to promote broadband adoption and literacy. Now, over the past 2 years, I don't think a lot has been done, if anything, to promote digital inclusion in Washington, D.C. And this, of course, once again leaves it up to cities and towns to fill the gap on their own. When I was at the FCC, I visited public housing in Kansas City, where Google Fiber was rolling out free gigabit service. The Google representatives told me that when they first went door to door offering the service, nobody would take it. Nobody gives away anything for free. people would say. Is Google spying on me? Is the government going to spy on me? It wasn't until Google hired members of the community to go door to door that people started to accept the service. Now, Kansas City has been a leader and continues to be one of the nationwide leaders in digital inclusion. As John Horrigan notes in a recent Benton Foundation report, the city has formed the Kansas City Coalition for Digital Inclusion, which has broad participation from schools, the Kansas City Public Library, local government, and the growing tech community. Among other things, the coalition gives low-cost computers to those in need, connects low-income residents to discounted broadband services, and teaches digital literacy. But Kansas City goes even further. The city's 2015 Digital Inclusion Report explicitly called for local businesses to engage with digital inclusion initiatives to increase the city's workforce skills. And Kansas City puts its money where its mouth is by having a dedicated fund that invests in a range of digital inclusion projects. Louisville, Kentucky also has an explicit digital inclusion plan that places a priority on preparing people for jobs where digital skills are required. Louisville partners with the startup community, the Louisville Free Library, and the federal government's Connect Home USA initiative to promote digital skills, digital literacy, and online access in low-income housing. These initiatives are done with little public funding and a lot of in-kind donations. As a result, Louisville is trying to build a digital inclusion fund similar to Kansas City's to be housed at the Community Foundation of Louisville. Another city the National Digital Inclusion Alliance has called a digital inclusion trailblazer is nearby Boston. Boston is expanding its wicked Wi-Fi. And I went to BU, and I used to be able to do a Boston accent. I'm obviously not from Boston. I'm from New York, even though I've lived in Washington for the last 25 years. Nobody could ever tell. But if anybody could say wicked Wi-Fi in a Boston accent, you know, I'll buy you a beer. What's that? Let's hear it, Deb. There you go, wicked Wi-Fi. There you go. So it is expanding its wicked Wi-Fi and its fiber network to all Boston Public Library branches and public schools, and is providing ongoing digital skills training and tools to low-income Bostonians. Boston also has a small digital equity fund, and I mean it's small. It's like $35,000. That gives grants to nonprofits that help people learn how to use the internet safely and securely, teach people how to use digital tools, and help broadband be more affordable. Unfortunately, the list of digital inclusion trailblazers is much smaller than it should be, just 16 cities, with only one, Wilson, North Carolina, that could be considered even partially rural. Whether or not communities are building their own broadband networks, ensuring that residents can afford and know how to use those networks must be part of their mission. So no speech of mine would be complete if I didn't talk about net neutrality. I feel like I sleep, eat, and whatever else has something to do with net neutrality. I did spend the morning in New York speaking at a panel debating net neutrality. So as most of you know, net neutrality is the principle that those companies providing the on-ramp to the internet should not favor or disfavor any content or services that ride over those pipes. In 2015, the Wheeler FCC passed the strongest ever net neutrality rules, prohibiting broadband internet access providers from blocking, throttling, or otherwise discriminating in favor or against certain internet content and services, including providing fast lanes for pay. In December 2017, the PI FCC repealed those rules and, more importantly, abdicated the agency's role overseeing the broadband market. And I can't emphasize that enough, because when people focus on net neutrality, they focus on the blocking and the throttling and the paid prioritization. In my mind, what's most important was the FCC said, really for the first time since net neutrality has been debated, which has been now about 18, 19 years, that we will have no oversight over broadband. You know, previous Republicans have argued whether we needed rules or whether principles were enough, but what Chairman Pai has said is we're washing our hands from it, okay? And in doing so, the FCC can no longer police broadband privacy, it can no longer police fraudulent billing or price gouging, or promote competition for that matter. Now, the PI FCC purported to give this power to the Federal Trade Commission, but the FTC lacks the technical and legal tools to oversee broadband networks. The FTC only has the legal power to punish broadband companies that tell their customers one thing and then do another. So if a broadband provider tells you, we're going to block, we're going to throttle, we're going to engage in paid prioritization, there's nothing the FTC can do about it. Now, it didn't take long for both states and cities to fill the gap left by the FCC. As I mentioned before, 34 states acted, either by introducing or passing net neutrality legislation or by adopting executive orders that require any broadband provider doing business with the state or locality to abide by the 2015 net neutrality rules. These actions had the effect of reversing the 20-year tide of deregulation urged by incumbent broadband companies to strip the states of authority to regulate broadband. Now, what was the company's rationale for this deregulation? The federal government has authority to regulate broadband, so the states don't have to. That's a shell game, right? Now, the federal government has stripped itself of authority, and the providers and the DOJ are saying, and the states can't either. A number of these net neutrality bills passed in Vermont, Oregon, Washington State, and California. The California bill is the strongest, as it codifies the entire 2015 Open Internet Order, including protecting the ability of content delivery networks and other transport providers to interconnect with incumbent broadband providers. The Department of Justice, not surprisingly, has sued California, and the broadband trade associations have sued Vermont. Their main arguments are that the FCC explicitly preempted the states from passing net neutrality laws of their own, and that broadband internet access is inherently an interstate service regulated by the federal government. The Vermont suit goes even further. I do find this remarkable, alleging that the state cannot set behavioral conditions on the ISPs with which the state does business. It's basically telling the states, you cannot make any demands of the businesses you contract with. That is essentially what they're saying. I find that really amazing. These arguments are flawed. While the FCC purported to preempt the states from adopting net neutrality protections of their own, an agency cannot abdicate its role protecting consumers and competition and at the same time tell the states they cannot do so either. Regulatory authority and preemption authority go hand in hand. Moreover, the Communications Act recognizes that communications networks have both interstate and intrastate characteristics. Indeed, telephone service is regulated both by states and the federal government, and cable service is a mix of state, local, and federal oversight. This preemption argument is also teed up to the challenge to the 2017 net neutrality repeal order, which is being heard in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. 22 states' attorneys general and the Attorney General for the District of Columbia have challenged the FCC's attempted preemption, and New England is well represented in that group, with the AGs of Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Vermont participating. I won't ask where New Hampshire is. So in conclusion, the American people owe a debt of gratitude to the communities and states that are working to ensure universal and affordable access to an open broadband internet. But as great as this work has been, it cannot substitute fully for the resources, expertise, and oversight of the federal government. Now, I've already mentioned some of the things we need from Washington: a law preempting state restrictions on community broadband, and reinstatement of FCC authority over broadband. Maps that tell you where broadband is actually deployed and at what price would also be really, really helpful. Supposedly, the FCC is working on that, and I think even they realize that measuring who has broadband by census block is ridiculous, and you cannot base policy on saying, well, if one person in a census block has broadband, then they all have broadband. So they're working on it. We'll see what happens. But here's what I think we need most of all, is we need a new broadband plan. And, you know, with apologies to my friend Blair Levin, the first plan was great, but it's now more than 8 years old, and it really needs a little bit of refreshing. And to Blair's credit, a lot of that, actually what he recommended, has gotten done, but we need a new one. Among other things, and perhaps the most important thing, that plan must come with a commitment of federal resources adequate to fund both the infrastructure needed to serve communities without broadband and the digital inclusion programs to make sure that these networks are utilized. If we are really going to be serious about getting rid of that 39% number, 39% of rural residents not having broadband, we're going to have to spend some coin. And I'm not talking about Connect America Fund. I'm talking about real money from the Treasury. And I hope, I'm actually somewhat optimistic, again, because broadband access has become such an electoral issue, that there'll be serious conversations about that. But I'm not going to talk anymore about the new National Broadband Plan or National Broadband Plan 2. Stay tuned. I'll have more to say about it in the coming year. Thank you very much, and thank you for staying. Yeah, sure, of course.
So if you have a couple of questions, we have time for just a few. Do we have any folks who would like to ask Gigi a question?
Everybody wants to have a beer. There's a question. It's nothing like being the last speaker. It's awesome.
Thank you very much. I'm one of your big fans. I've been following policy of the internet for quite some time.
Great, I'll sign your, I'll sign your program.
Please do. I've got the page. I used to do research at IBM Research Lab about 20 years ago. We were looking at the public policy implications of the internet. And we looked at everything from taxes to everything. And today, the town of West Hartford, you could get your marriage license online, which is pretty good. My question to you is that there's a great wave of new technologies coming online, AI, blockchain, and all that. But from the application perspective is the healthcare, and that's something I'm very much into, both from the technology side as well as the policy side. But if we have this throttling and all that, it's going to really affect the cost of healthcare. I'm just trying to simplify it as much as possible. And
yeah, I mean, I think, look, that's problematic as well. I mean, it's obviously problematic if you're trying to do remote surgery and your ISP can throttle you. That's a major problem. But I also just think that this is another place, telehealth is another place where there are just not enough government resources. The FCC has a pretty tiny rural healthcare fund, but I don't think it's nearly enough to move the needle. So I share your concern about, throttling and, slowing things down, speeding things up. But I also worry that there's just not enough resources to get the job done in the places that need it.
You mentioned that there's a well-worn intrastate divide for Title II services. If it's ruled that internet service can indeed be Title I, what role is there to divide internet services between the states and federal government? Is there any?
Well, I think at that point, well, I will say in the net neutrality repeal order, the FCC did leave open some things that it said the state could do, right? Like protect consumers from fraudulent billing, that sort of thing. It did not touch privacy, interestingly enough. It didn't explicitly say that it would preempt privacy, but it didn't say it wouldn't either. Okay, so I think there could be some narrow role for states and localities to continue to regulate in this space, but it wouldn't be net neutrality, and I'm sure it would not be asserting, general regulatory authority over broadband.
I'm also a Gigi Sohn fan from way back.
Hey! Came down from Maine.
Yeah. I had a question about a program I think really rolled out under the Wheeler FCC. When I was in Maine doing policy work, the CAF2 program was really the main way that rural broadband was going to be solved by the FCC. And I was wondering if you had thoughts about whether that program has lived up to its potential and ways for municipalities to leverage that program if it's happening in their communities, and ways it's changed under the PI FCC.
Yeah, I don't think it's lived up to its potential, because I think we've kind of made a mistake in this country by just, I guess as my mother would say in Yiddish, stooping the incumbent ISPs with money rather than investing in infrastructure. So our friend and my former colleague Harold Feld has a great idea that we should shift CAF funds to building backbone, right? As opposed to, and let people bring the last mile with them, as opposed to just giving the incumbents money. Now I know Wheeler, in kind of an odd, sort of a odd bedfellows coalition with Republican Commissioner O'Reilly and Democratic Commissioner Clyburn, tried to sort of set some limits on what these carriers could spend money on, because they were spending money on, airplanes and artwork, and I'm not sure how well that worked. I just think, I think the CAF fund needs a rethink. And again, the problem is the infrastructure. It's not the last mile.
Thanks, Gigi. I think this is the last question, I'm told. It's actually maybe not the best way to end the day, but no one who opposed net neutrality or voted to gut privacy restrictions has faced the challenge at the box, at the election box, very seriously. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, and whether that has to change before we can, really win the battle for the open internet.
Well, I don't know if I agree with the premise, I think, of your question, because nobody has yet looked at, I doubt that net neutrality was the reason that anybody lost, okay? But a lot of net neutrality opponents lost. And in fact, all the House members, the Democratic House members who signed this bill that would reverse the repeal and bring back the 2015 rules all got reelected. Now, I'm not saying that was because of net neutrality. In fact, the only Republican who signed it, a guy named Mike Kaufman, got kicked to the curb. So, I do think for things to, things are going to wend their way through the court, and we'll see what happens. But I do agree with you that in order for there to be a strong net neutrality bill in the future, it's going to have to become more of an electoral issue. And I, frankly, have been urging my colleagues in the public interest community is, let's tie it to the overall general concern about lack of broadband. And I do think it's tied. Because, again, it's about whether there's going to be an agency who's tasked with promoting affordable and ubiquitous broadband. And right now, there is not one.
Could you all join me in thanking Gigi Sohn so much for being here? We are so appreciative.